We find all sorts of ways to make decisions more easily. One way is by using rules of thumb. I'm going to have a chat with Zoe Creelman, who's done some work around rules of thumb and how we can use them to help us make better decisions. So Zoe, we're talking about different facets of decision making. Can you tell us a bit about rules of thumb?
Yeah, Cam. Rules of thumb distill complex information down into some simple one-liners. We use them all the time, often without actually realising it. So I always grew up with the rule of thumb that if it's going to be a good season, we've had our autumn break by Anzac Day and you start sowing.
So why do we use rules of thumb?
Rules of thumb package a lot of information in a neat little phrase. They're really helpful for being a start point for a decision. Sometimes when there's so much information it can be a bit overwhelming, but a rule of thumb gives us something tangible to begin with. And it's also really helpful for remembering a punchline of a project. Yep. I've got quite a bad memory, but if someone gives me a rule of thumb when they're trying to explain new findings or a new project, I'm much more likely to remember that catchy little punchline than if they give me a really long explanation of it. There can also be a level of comfort associated with following a rule of thumb, as it can defer the responsibility away from the individual. You know, I heard of someone who was doing the grain marketing for her partner's family farm, and the rule of thumb that the family always followed was to sell a third of grain after sowing, a third at harvest, and a third after harvest. So she followed that same rule every year, regardless of grain prices, because it meant that she wasn't solely responsible for the grain marketing, and it gave her a certain immunity to the blame from the family. Rules of thumb can be really helpful when there's lots of uncertainty or it's a complex decision that we have to make. It gives us a level of comfort in knowing that we're not having to make the rule ourselves, that we're following something that's been tried and accepted.
And saves time?
Yeah, so if you're having to go over all of the data every time you're wanting to make a decision, it's really time consuming. And in farming, there's just so many decisions to be made. Rules of thumb simplify it down and make it so much faster.
Which can be important, I imagine, when things are time critical. Okay, so there are good things about rules of thumb, but what are some of the traps?
It can be really dangerous if you're taking a rule of thumb that's been developed for someone else's system and you're trying to apply it to your own system. You always want to make sure that rules of thumb fit your individual context, particularly if you're taking them from a different growing region. So in the southwest, when we started cropping, we took quite a lot of rules of thumb from the Mallee, and they just didn't fit with our farming systems down here.
So do you have any tricks of knowing if the rules of thumb that you're using are fit for the job at hand?
Yeah, so we developed a series of questions through some workshops a couple of years ago to help us interrogate our rules of thumb and say, is this a good rule that fits our system, or do we need to change it or disregard it? So I remember it by thinking about we need a good rule of thumb to have a good shot at a decision. So in SHOT, the S stands for source. You know, where did you first hear the rule? Did it come from a parent or agronomist, a researcher, a neighbour? Is the source local or from a different region? Does the source have a knowledge of your type of operation that you run? The H in SHOT stands for heart. Now, we know that we use our head, our heart and our gut in making decisions. So what are the values and beliefs and emotions that this rule of thumb speaks to?
So why would the heart come into it?
Yeah, sometimes we use rules of thumb for different reasons. It might be out of loyalty to someone who's been using the rule in the past, particularly if it was a grandparent or a parent who's been running the farm before us. There can be a real sense of satisfaction if we're following a rule which gives us, we know when we've ticked it off and we've got that kind of satisfaction of completing something. There can also be a sense of security and safety, I suppose. Like that woman with the grain marketing, in having a rule that's been tried and approved by neighbours or family members, and that's sort of our safeguard against feeling like we've failed. All of these are valid and understandable, but it's important to recognise them honestly so other people involved in the decision making understand where you're coming from, and so you can be freed up to sit back and assess whether the rule is still working in your best interest. The O stands for outcomes. What outcomes have you had with using this rule in the past? Our experiences are huge in informing our intuition, but sometimes if we have a rule of thumb we're particularly fond of, we might overlook the fact that the outcomes haven't been stacking up. And finally, T, is there anything that needs tweaking? Have you been able to adapt the rule in the past so that it fits the season or the situation better? Or does the rule need to be changed so it's better suited? Our seasons have been much more variable in recent years than it was for our parents and our grandparents, so we probably need to reconsider some of the rules that we grew up with. Other things change our risk appetite, like if you've got kids coming back to the farm, or if they're not coming back to the farm, it might change things like how many seasons you want to pay off new machinery, things like that.
We spend a lot of money on fertiliser and lime each year, and a rule of thumb that I use is for maintenance about 0.7 of a kilogram of phosphorus per DSE. And that's a rule of thumb we've used for a fair while.
That's interesting. Do you remember the source where you first heard the rule of thumb?
Yeah, look, it's probably the Ag Department way back in the 1990s. They did some really good research around that sort of stuff, and yeah, I suppose that's where I picked it up, and that's sort of the rule that I've been using.
Yeah. How about the H, the heart? How does it fit within your values and belief system and your goals on the farm?
Yeah, well, I suppose I've got a scientific background, and so it seemed credible to me. It was sort of, it was something I could trust because I thought it was done by good researchers and some good research.
Yeah. And the O, what were the outcomes of using the rule?
Yeah, it was interesting. Used it for a lot of years, and because we do regular soil testing here, I could just see by using that rule we seem to over fertilise. And so that's when I sort of thought, well, maybe this rule doesn't really hold.
And so did you use the T and tweak it at all and change the rule?
Yeah, we did in the end. And so what I use now is 0.5 of a kilogram of phosphorus. So I had to pull it back a bit, and we've found that level suits our system and suits the way we operate. And now I can be far more accurate in the fertiliser I'm putting on.
Yeah, fantastic. That's great.
Now it's your turn. I'd like you to think about a rule of thumb that you might use regularly and consider, does it give you the best shot at making a good decision?